Hi, everyone. This is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and our blog and our newsletter and our great sponsors, Abitativa Casa, Italy Rooting, and Phil Italy. And my guest today is George Gingerelli. So welcome, George. Thanks for being here.
And thanks for having me, Bob.
My pleasure. And we had a few bugs to work out, but we're here now. Always the case, right?
Right.
So, we have a sad thing to share about our good friend Gianluca in Calabria. I was totally blown away when I saw that pop up on Facebook. He was such a super guy. I never got to meet him in person, but you met him in person, yeah?
A couple of times. In 2016, he was our guide and driver. And by the end of the 3 weeks, he was our best friend and compatriot. And so we used him again in 2022. And unfortunately, during that time, my wife was ill and had to be taken to the hospital. And I'll tell you, Gianluca was like, he drove us back and forth to the hospital. He took care of my daughter and her family while I was visiting my wife. He was like a brother. And yeah, I will miss him a lot.
No, I'm sure. And it was just, quite a sudden thing. And I think he's got at least a young daughter, right?
Teenager. He has a teenage daughter. Yes.
Yeah. That's terrible. They're really, really terrible. And yeah, when we were in Calabria, I was doing a tour with somebody else and he was doing a tour and we just couldn't hook up. So when did you start and why did you start researching your family?
I got interested. My mother was sort of the center of everything that had to do with our family. And when she passed, it seemed like nobody got together again. And I tried to make that happen by contacting some of the cousins who were now spread all over the country. And we ended up having a reunion in Worcester, Massachusetts, which is where my family's from. And got together all the cousins on my father's side and all the cousins on my mother's side, many of whom had never met each other. And at the same time, I said, I wonder if we have cousins in Italy. And my sister and I had heard stories for years from our grandmother and our aunts and uncles about this place called Montescaglioso, and which is where my maternal grandmother and maternal grandfather were both from. And so I made some inquiries about whether or not I went to Ancestry and made inquiries about whether there were any people with that last name in Montescaglioso. And my sister and I decided that the only way we were going to find out was to actually go there. We determined that my grandfather had a brother who who had stayed in Montescaglioso and had children. And so if there were any cousins, they were going to be in that line. So we called around for a guide. We found Gianluca. He took us to Montescaglioso. And I like to say the miracle happened because there had been no contact for 100 years. We expected nothing. And what we ended up instead was finding 4 generations of cousins in Montescaglioso.
Wow, that's something. So now, did they know that they had family in the United States?
The oldest of we met these 3 women, the 3 sisters who were the children of my grandfather's brother. And the oldest one of them said she remembered that her uncle, my grandfather, had gone to America and that they had sent clothing back to the family, however many years ago that was, close to 100 years. But they had lost contact and knew nothing of us, and we knew nothing of them.
Oh, that's really something. It's so exciting when you find that, right?
I can't tell you how exciting. We had several attempts and failures while we were there trying to find these people. We didn't know if they were dead or alive. We just knew that these people had been born in Montescaglioso. The Gianluca and the woman from the hotel, without them, this whole project would have failed. They took us to the town hall, went through the record books, found that the three women, the three daughters, who at that time were 72, 82, and 92, that all three of them were still alive and well and living in the town. So we called and weren't able to get through. We walked, because Montescaglioso is not a big place. We walked from the hotel to the home of one of the three sisters, knocked on the door, and no answer. So we were ready to say, hey, we've done our best. And both Gianluca and the woman from the hotel, Lucia, said, no, let's go to the other house of one of the other sisters. And we did that. This was the 92-year-old woman, and she wouldn't let us in because she was afraid. So we said, okay, we tried. On our way back to the hotel, we stopped again at the home of the 72-year-old, and again, no answer, but a woman came out from the next house and said, that's my aunt. Who are you? We explained. She got on the phone. She called her aunt. 5 minutes later, a car pulled up with the 72-year-old and the 82-year-old, and we explained who we were. But the 72-year-old, who, by the way, was the same age as I was at that time. So it was kind of weird because she's my mother's first cousin, but she was my age, and she was very skeptical. So I had an iPad and I showed pictures of my grandfather, and that helped. But then I showed a picture of my grandfather's mother, who is her grandmother. And she had the same picture on the wall in her home. And it was a magical moment. She just lit up. She hugged me and my sister and she said, Cucini di America. From then on, people just kept showing up. They threw a party for us 2 days later, and they rented out a restaurant, I think. And there were 45 people showed up, 4 different generations, from these little babies to this 92-year-old matriarch. And we partied until well after midnight. And these people had to go to work in the morning, so it was amazing. And anyway, yeah, it was so special. We still talk about it today because one of the things that my sister and I wanted to accomplish was, if we're going to, now that we know we have relatives in Italy, it would be a shame for that contact to go another 100 years with nobody seeing each other. So I wanted to explain to the younger people, the sons and daughters and grandchildren of Le Tre Sorelle, I wanted to explain to them that I wanted this contact to continue with people from their generation, like my daughters. And it was an interesting conversation because I speak a bit of Italian, and I'm talking to these young people who are talking a mile a minute, but we managed to communicate. And I said, here's my goal. I want you and your generation to be in contact with your cousins in America. And we all looked at each other looking for a solution. And then this one young man, Antonio, looked at me and said, with bright eyes, George, Facebook. The next morning, I had 12 new friends on Facebook. And over the years, that has been Facebook and WhatsApp and a few other forms of communication. We now have fairly frequent contact with people from Montescaglioso, with my daughter, with another one of my cousins. Anyway, the smiles continue.
Yeah, and I have so many contacts there now. It's not funny, and some cousins that I never knew, And in fact, I guess it was about 3 weeks ago now, I got a message on Facebook with a picture that I have. I have this same picture of my father's family. And she said, I'm your cousin. And I knew he was because he had the same picture, obviously. And I didn't know that. I only knew of my father's brother here and sister in Italy who was a nun. I didn't know about any of the other family. And they had 4 other siblings, two men and 2 women. You know, I didn't know that there were any Sorrentinos. I found my grandmother's family. I didn't know there were any Sorrentinos there. And now I do. We're going to Milan in May, and actually 2 of them, I think, live in Milan. So hopefully we'll get to meet them. And it's just so much fun. And I've said this before. I think they enjoy it almost more than we do.
I agree. When the evening was over, I addressed the crowd and told them how excited we were to to meet them, to know that we had relatives, and I thanked them. And this one young man got up and he said, "No, we thank you. We are honored to have you here." And at first I thought that was really a strange comment, but what was finally clear is that the fact that we took the time and traveled to find them really warmed their hearts, and they have continued to send that message over the years that that what we did was something that they really appreciate.
Yeah, and like I said, that's exactly what I found. So now, do you know why your grandfather came?
Yeah. He came over right after the turn of the century. It was during the Italian diaspora when so many people from southern Italy emigrated and ended up in Europe, other parts of Europe, but so many came to the U.S. And a lot of them settled in places like New York and Massachusetts. And when they settled with other people that they had traveled with, but my grandfather needed a job. There were no jobs in southern Italy. And when I talk about southern Italy, we're talking south of Naples. We're talking about places like Calabria and in my case Basilicata. These people not only didn't have jobs, but after Italy became a country in 1861, when the country unified, all the power and all the money was north, and no money seemed to filter its way down to the south. And the bottom line is there were no jobs, and people like my grandfather left to find work, and he did. He came to Worcester, Massachusetts, and got a job hauling in the winter and ice in the summer. And that was his job. And he managed to raise a bunch of children, and I'm here.
My mother's father was an iceman. And people don't realize what kind of job that was, especially in New York City, because they used to carry them up 100 pounds on their back up 5 flights of stairs.
Same here. He lived in a 3-story tenement, and that's where he delivered ice to all of those. Yeah. I don't know. These people, my grandfather was small. None of us in that family are much over 5'6", 5'7", and he must have been the strongest an ox.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.co. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co.
Yeah, well, my uncles, when they were young, I guess in the 20s and 30s, they did it too. And my uncles were like bulls. I mean, my father's family is like short. My mother's family was a little bit taller. In fact, a couple of my uncles were probably close to 6 foot, but they were like bulls. I mean, they were really, really strong guys, And, they were like, I always tell people I had, besides my parents, I had 8 other sets of parents because my mother's brothers and sisters, they were like our parents, growing up back then. And you didn't dare get out of line with them.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't. My grandfather's siblings, as we know, one of them stayed in Montescaglioso. I don't know anything about the others. But my grandmother, her sister also came over. And in fact, it was because her sister had come over and gotten married in Worcester. And the story goes that my grandfather went to his good friend and said, I want a wife like you have. And the only way I can do that is I want a wife from Montescaglioso. And so the story goes that this woman contacted her sister, who's my grandmother, and said, you need to come over here, and I have a man that you can marry, and the rest is history. That she came, like my grandmother came over in 1912. I think the requirement back then was you had to have a reason for coming. You had to have somebody in the U.S. that you were in contact with. And so the ship manifest, which I have a copy of, shows my grandmother, and her contact in the U.S. was her sister, and her reason for coming to the U.S. was to marry Michele di Taranto, my grandfather. And sure enough, she gets to the U.S., and 3 days later, they were married just outside of New York Harbor and had 13.
My goodness. Wow. So they got married 3 days later.
Yeah.
That's something. That's something.
That as children, we were told a much more romantic story that that they got married on the boat. But 3 days later is pretty close.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's the way it was back then. So now, have you done DNA?
Yes.
So did you find anything like that blew you away with that?
It's interesting that I'm finding lots of new cousins on my father's side. My father's family's from Calabria, which Gianluca was so happy to show me his Calabria, and he considered us to be true paisanos. But the cousins that I'm getting through the DNA test mostly seem to be from that side of the family, which is strange to me because we were so much closer to my mother's side of the family, mainly because we all lived in the same neighborhood. But yeah, I'm finding lots of cousins. The problem that most people need to be aware of when you do DNA is you're not going to find all good news. You hope that you find only information that makes you happy, but occasionally you find something in your family's history that you wish you didn't know. And that's happened to me on my father's side. Yeah.
Really?
There were some people that weren't very...
Yeah. I mean, I didn't find anything like that, but I did. One of my cousins was adopted, and she had her mother had an affair with my cousin. He was still married. And when I saw it pop up on Ancestry, my cousin's 3 children were on Ancestry. I called my cousin Donna and I said, "Did you see on Ancestry?" She goes, "Yes, I saw." I said, "Did you have any idea?" And she said the only thing she remembers around that time, because this woman is about the same age as my cousin, that she remembers her mother crying in the bedroom for like 2 weeks. They must have known. They had to have known. There were, and my friend, he found an older brother that he never knew existed. And it was a child from before his before his parents were married in Brooklyn. So
perhaps the most interesting thing that's come from the DNA is I was contacted by a woman who said she was my second cousin. And you end up with a lot of second and third cousins. But in this case, this woman told me a story that her father had just passed away, and she was going through his affairs and discovered that he was not her biological father. Apparently, her mother had had an affair when she was a young girl, and the the father of the baby didn't want to have anything to do with her. And instead, this man came and married her and adopted her baby and moved them from Massachusetts to New Hampshire. And so this woman grew up thinking that her mother and father were her biological mother and father. And she was 70 years old when she found out that her father was not her biological father. And so through DNA, she figured out who her biological father was and was asking me if I would help her make contact with the family. Well, long story short, sometimes you don't want people to know about their parents' sordid past. And so this guy had turned out to be a wonderful man, had a very successful business, had 5 beautiful children, and the last thing the family needed was to find out that they had that he had had an affair and they had a half sister. I have not stayed in contact with this woman, but it turns out she decided not to soil the family's memories, but she had a daughter, and her daughter is now on Ancestry putting together a family tree and is putting in her actual grandfather. So everybody's going to find out, and I don't think people really care as much now as they did back then. Excuse me.
No, I think you're right. And in fact, I mean, some people, some people want to know this kind of stuff too, because you find your real family. So it's nothing to say that you didn't, love and respect the adoptive parents, but, you find your own family. I mean, my kids are adopted, so we've been through that, and I had them both. I did them on Ancestry, and my daughter found her birth mother. In Florida, they can do there's a registry that you could sign up for. But her birth parents didn't do that. So I had to get a private investigator to find them. And so she's in contact with them. And then my son, he was never really that interested until about, 5-6 years ago. I got a message on Ancestry, and she said, my mother is Crystal and I'm Matthew's sister, and, I'd like to meet him. And I said, well, I have to ask him. I said, he's a grown man, and I can't decide for him. But yeah, so he did, and he stays in touch with them, with his, birth mother and stuff like that. But, things have changed with respect to all of that kind of stuff,
I think it's wonderful. My experience, it was and continues to be so important in my life now. When I met these strangers, it didn't take more than a few minutes for us to feel what people feel when they're from the same bloodline. We were cousins who didn't know each other, and by the end of the day, we were as close as any cousins I'd ever grown up with.
I know there is a bond there. It's hard to explain, right?
And I really and truly want that to continue. I'm 80 years old now, so I'm not gonna be around. Well, I'll say 20. Not going to be around 20 years from now, and I want this contact to continue.
You never know. You look great for 80. I'll say that.
Thanks.
You look really good for 80, and you never know. That was the thing that blew me away. Same thing. My father's first cousins, they were all in their 90s, because they were from my grandmother's youngest brother. So there was 18 years difference between my grandmother and them.
Yeah.
So they were basically just a little bit younger than my father was, or would have been at the time. And like you said, as soon as we walked into the apartment, there was that bond.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Having met them and having, especially, I keep using that phrase, because my mother was one of 3 sisters, and here there were another set of 3 sisters, and as I mentioned, at the time, they were 72, 82, and 92. So the 72-year-old is now 80, like I am. The other two finally passed away, but only recently. So there's definitely longevity in the Di Taranto family.
Yeah. So Di Taranto, are they from Taranto originally? Do you know?
Yeah. What we found out when we went to the town hall is there are an awful lot of people with that last name. And the reason is, as one of your participants recently was talking about, he wrote a couple of books about the origin of Italian names. Well, this is a perfect example. Those people are from Basilicata, which is Montescaglioso, is very close to the Gulf of Taranto, and their last name is Di Taranto because they're all from there. Di Taranto is like Smith in Montescaglioso. So you see people with that last name marrying other people with that same last name, and they're not they're not related. They're just all from the area around Taranto.
Oh, yeah. I have cousins. I have cousins there. In Taranto. They're from one of my grandmother's brothers. He was an admiral in the Italian Navy. There's a big Navy base in Taranto.
Yeah.
Nice
Have you
city.
been there?
Yeah, we were there last year.
Did you go to Matera?
We went to Matera last year too. Yeah.
Yeah. I could live there.
I'll tell you, the place that we love more than any place was Sheila. I don't know if you've been to Sheila.
No, it was on our list when my wife got ill. I ended up spending. She was in the hospital for 3 weeks in Matera, and it was amazing how good the care was. They pretty much saved her life. But while she was in the hospital, I was living in Matera, thanks to Gianluca finding me a B&B, and I just fell in love with the place.
Yeah, it's a cool place. It's really a neat place for sure. And it's amazing that there were people living in caves up until the 60s.
Yeah. John Lucas took us when we first visited there in 2016. He took us through the caves and the churches and whatever. And one of the things about that man that people will miss, he wasn't just a guide. He was a historian. He was a storyteller. He made you understand how important what you were looking at, how important it was, what the history was. And he had a passion, especially in Calabria, but also when we were in Matera.
Yeah. And I sensed that too. Like I said, although we never met him, I sensed that he had a great passion for Calabria. Did he tell you his grandmother's story about how God created Calabria?
Yes.
A great story. That was such a great story.
Yes.
So you had to live there for 3 weeks and under not pleasant circumstances, I suppose, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Did you have insurance to cover everything? I always get the insurance to make sure we cover everything.
I hesitate to say this out loud because we have never received any charges.
Really?
What I found out is if you're involved in an emergency situation, which this was, an ambulance had to come and get her, et cetera, et cetera. They never asked us for any insurance information. They just took care of her. She saw 5 or 6 different doctors, and we have all the records, but nobody ever asked us for a dime.
That's fantastic. That's great.
Yeah,
I didn't know.
It's been 2 years, and every time I open the mailbox, I keep waiting.
Waiting for that charge to show up. Well, I guess if it hasn't shown up by now, it's not going to show up at all. But who knows if Gianluca or someone didn't have something to do with that also, you never know. Yeah, that's super. Like I said, we always get the insurance just in case.
Yeah, which I think is a really good idea. And we certainly will forevermore.
Yeah, going forward for sure. And the first trip we had, my daughter's a nurse. So the first trip that we went 2 years ago, my daughter was there. So I figured at least we have a nurse traveling with us. So that's one good thing to have a medical professional in the family. And now she's in the last stage of, she wants to be a nurse practitioner, a psychiatric nurse practitioner. And I don't know why she wants to be a psychiatric nurse practitioner, but that's what she wants to do, right? So, well, George, this has been certainly a lot of fun, great stories and reminiscing about the great guy, for sure.
Yeah. And I really appreciate what you are doing. I'm very proud of my Italian heritage. I've been involved in some Italian American organizations here in the Las Vegas area. And one of the things we keep preaching is the importance of having the generations that follow us understand their heritage, appreciate their heritage, and honor their heritage. And I think what you're doing is a big part of that.
Well, thanks. And, I was never part of an Italian American organization until last year. My brother joined one in Florida, and just, a great bunch of guys, and they contribute, $100 and something thousand a year for scholarships, and then, give back to the community in so many different ways. And, it's really great. And they made me the chairman of the cultural committee. So there you go. I got a job. But, it's my passion. And I think they sense that. That's why they did it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's an Italian-American club here. Because it's Las Vegas, the history of the Italian-American organizations includes some pretty neat names like Frank Sinatra. And they trade on that a lot. But there's also a couple of organizations that raise scholarship money for Italian-American kids. And that's all good stuff.
Yeah, no, it is. Well, thanks again. I appreciate it.